Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to yet another episode of Right Circle, which is presented by Sri Cements and our associates, our SAS Women and Spagia Foundation. We have very special people with us today. Nisha Susan, more than being a writer, I have seen her in my eyes. I mean, in my mind, I can visualize her as someone who is um, very active, has a very definite mindset, and has a very spunky way of speaking what is on her mind. And when I was reading the book, that's the first thing that came to my mind, like, oh my God, this is Nisha talking. And the best part is about writers who get away with the way, if they write the way they speak and get away with it, it's fantastic. And she's managed to achieve that in her book called The Women Who Forgot to Invent Facebook and Other Stories. The title itself is really attractive. She's also the co-founder of two award-winning media companies, The Lady's Finger and Grist Media, both of them whom I'm a huge fan of. She's currently also writing a column called Cheap Thrills or for millennials in Mint Lounge, and she used to work with the Helga much earlier, and has also been commissioning editor for Yahoo Originals, which is still on. Nisha, is it?
No, not anymore.
Not anymore.
It's
Okay.
been gone a few.
Yeah, and then her nonfiction is focused on culture, gender, and politics, and her fiction that's been published in N+1, Caravan, Penguin, and Zuban, and other publishers. It's amazing how she just explores the intimacy and strangeness that the internet has brought to India. Along with Nisha, we have another stellar, very multi-talented, multifaceted person with us, Deepika Arvind, who is first and foremost a poet and then a playwright, a director, a performer. She runs something called the Lost Post Initiative. The name itself is very intriguing. Theatre and Performing Arts Collective that works collaboratively with diverse artists and largely around gender and women on stage. So you can see why the two are here together. Her work has been presented across the world in many countries, has won several awards and fellowships, and she's currently touring productions nationally, internationally. Right now, I think she's in Dubai. I was just listening to them talk, so I know. But without further ado, and she also has a book called Sarayu, which was published in France in 2018. With that, I'm going to leave Nisha Susan and Deepika Arvind to take over from here. Before all of you audiences walked into the Zoom meeting, I wish you could have walked in, literally. We really missed that. We were remembering our good old times when JLF used to happen and we used to all meet and eat together and all the fun we had, but those times will come back. I want to thank each one of you for being here with us. Over to Nisha and Deepika.
Hi, Nisha.
Hello.
I am so happy to be doing this, even if we are not in the same city, which we generally are.
Yeah, I
But
think the audience knows that usually we are in the same neighborhood by like a couple of streets. It's just
that's
a
true.
little strange that Deepika and I are having this conversation with what? The Arabian Ocean between us right now?
Yes. Yeah, this is strange. I'm so very delighted to be talking to you about this book because I remember when I read The Women Who Invented Facebook, the title story, I think it was in the out of print magazine. I read it and I think this must have been like 8 years ago. Correct me
That's
if yeah. And I remember thinking, wow, this is like this is this is me. This is me in college. This is the bar. Like it reminded me of Picos. It reminded me of streets in Bangalore. It reminded me of a very specific city that I grew up in as a young person. And I also remember thinking, wow, this is a form of short fiction that seems so easy and so And much like Neeta said, just like somebody is talking and journaling a time in their life, and so I was very intrigued, and I'm so happy that now we have this gorgeous collection of stories. And I'm very happy to be talking to you about it. So shall we dive in?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, so as the title suggests, the internet is plays a huge part in this book. In fact, even the paragraph separators are like the little Wi-Fi that's signage. And as you talk about the strangeness and intimacy that the internet has brought to, but we're talking about a cusp generation. Both you and I think we are in the same generation. We saw the advent of the landline. I know that we went from all the way from Walkman to to streaming on Spotify. So there's also a very specific kind of internet in this book, the one that is like OkCupid dating sites to like live press and live journal and WordPress blogs. um, I just want to know a little bit about how you sort of chronicled it. In a sense, was that intentional that you chronicled this particular internet, or you were talking about an internet that you
Right.
saw? Yeah.
So it's a bit of a mix. So I wrote a bunch of stories which had the internet as a theme, and I wrote this over many years. And sometimes the stories were about that moment of the internet. I wrote it as things were like playing out. So, for instance, a Gentle Reader is about the experience of Twitter and how that plays out as it happened. But the trolling and sort of political arguments and things being misinterpreted and all of that drama. But the story, The Women Who Forgotten When Facebook, is something I wrote many years after that moment. In that story, there is no real sense of the internet in people's lives. It's kind of a joke. They don't know the phrase social network, so they talk about something that could have been something, but it's only in retrospect. It's only the reader who gets a full sense of the joke. And then later, once I was commissioned to put this book together, I wrote a few stories very specifically, looking at experiences which are current. So there is a sort of crime story in this book called No Filter, which is about the unfiltered reminiscences of somebody quite nutty, and but it is also about the experience of being stalking someone through Instagram. And so some were written to the task in that sense of rounding out the book, but some were written for other reasons. The Women Who Forgotten When Facebook, actually that particular story, I wrote it as an experiment to write it in first person plural. So the full story is we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this, in the way that young people, like very young people, experience themselves as part of a group, right? You did a lot of things together. We felt this.
Yeah.
You didn't feel this. So I wanted to try that out. And so that's where the story worked out. So there were different impulses, but once the book came together, I was like, okay, I want to try and chart a whole lot of things, including, the sound that the modem made when you had dial-up, all kinds of little things that are part of our immediate lives and then suddenly just became something else altogether, right?
Yeah. And I love, in fact, the title story, I think for me, the title of it, it includes everything that I like and embody. Perhaps, I don't know, like forgetfulness for sure. I like how it's sort of, they just forgot. I mean, it's almost this kind of throwaway thing. And only when you finish reading the story do you realize, do you get the full extent of the joke, in that they are the social network and this thing has existed all our lives. It was only when, somebody sitting in the Bay Area decided that like women needed to be rated as hot or not, and then it became Facebook. But technically these maps, these interconnected like lives have always existed. And I know that when I was in college, we often talked about well, not a sex map, but like we talked about a map of like, oh, she actually used to date him, and that one is that one's uncle. Like, it's just this essentially gossip in a sense, but gossip on ourselves, about ourselves. So yeah, I thought that as the story is has nothing to do with the internet, but it's so playful, um, that I remember thinking, wow, this is a story that any of us could have written when we were young, but like we didn't. And yeah,
And I mean, that moment has to pass for it to be registered as a moment, right? Which is what the
correct.
story is also about, because you're so busy having a good time of a kind that it's very hard to register it as a moment or a era, which is, that it's not quite in that Purani Jeans nostalgia zone, but it is about turning around and saying, okay, there was this 3-year period that I like, basically I was mostly drunk, right? And what was I doing in that time, and what were we all doing, and do we remember those people? And
Yeah.
sort of looking at it, but with affection, but not nostalgia.
Nostalgia, yeah, and I also think nostalgia is a very dangerous thing, especially when, as writers, when you rely on nostalgia to be the only anchor in a piece of writing, whether it's fiction or even a novel, because I think nostalgia is very fragile and very, very fleeting. Rather, the book, like the story, is so throwaway and remembers details about certain people in certain ways that memory. That's how sort of memory is in that sense, and it's not always sepia tinted. It's much more spiky and edgy, and that's what I like about it. And
There's this story, a short story of Paul Zacharias, the Malayali writer. He's like
Malayali writer.
literally giant, and now he has a novel in English and perhaps more in translation soon. So he's super funny, and his short stories are just perfect. Okay, they're just perfect. So one of his short stories, The End of Third-Rate Literature, Munangra Sahityathindandiyam is what it's called in Malayalam. It's set in Delhi, and there is a mediocre writer and a really first class writer. So the mediocre writer makes a pact with the devil, and sort of offers him things so that the devil will get him up in the social ladder. So the devil takes those offerings and goes to the home of the first class writer. They're both Malayali writers living in Delhi, so this is all like implicit jokes. Okay, so he goes to the home of the first class, like really excellent Malayali writer, and he plants a toddy palm tree in his backyard. Okay, which is like sprouts overnight. And
Right.
I mean, there's all these jokes about how the devil is flying, and the Indian Air Force thinks it's a Pakistani plane, and there's all that going on the side, like crazy stuff. But fundamentally, what happens is that the excellent writer comes out, he sees the toddy palm tree, and he becomes overcome by nostalgia, and he stops being a good writer. I mean,
Oh wow.
ineffective, because stops being a writer at all, and it's just like, many things have to happen for him to regain his prowess. So it's a really funny story about how nostalgia dooms your writing.
Oh wow. So I wasn't just guessing then.
No.
It's not a personal preference. It seems to be some sort of universal thing. Yeah, and speaking of Kerala, actually, and that makes its way into the book quite often, different places. Ranni, is that how you say it?
Rani.
Rani, okay. And yeah, several places. I mean, clearly, because you're Malayali and because you have like several connections with Kerala, but also because I somehow feel like you write about some very unusual places in Kerala, like unexpected places. You're not writing about like, it's not a tourist brochure. About Fort Kochi for sure. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with that place? And I guess
So,
as you as a Malayali.
yeah, so Rani is close to where my father's hometown is, and it's just a place. It's just a place which is part of my family life. It's also strange because I've not really lived in Kerala a lot, but I used to go frequently. My mom's side pretty much has been in Karnataka for 3 generations. My dad's side was in Malaysia and then in the Middle East. And my parents spent their entire adult lives abroad, doing the Malayalis and Gulf thing. So, I mean, Kerala is in my head only as part of like really excellent anecdotes, okay, and like really, really like the best place for stories. So
Yeah.
I feel like my interest in other people is something that was created by growing up partially in Kerala and growing up around Malayalis who are like my mom. I think the strongest judgment she can make against a relative is that they are very boring and they don't have good stories. That is her biggest like moral judgment on someone else. So that's what I like about being Malayali. Enjoy that.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I was going to say something about anecdotes, but then I thought I would save it. But we have reached there anyway. Um, it's related to many things, actually, anecdotes. We were talking about this. So I'm going to split that into a couple of parts. The first one is circling right back to the book, actually. The book is full of women, as the title suggests, but not only women. Um, the but the book, and it doesn't treat women in this like, because the stories are largely about women, it's not like this very grand lofty kind of setup. And also the women are not grand and lofty. In fact, they are general bodies, as I like to call them. They're artists, they're writers, they're thinkers, they're languishing, they're in flux, they're between things, they're bored, they're also they're
Often.
often bored, and also somewhat questionable. Many things about them, which is really wonderful, because the book never pitches itself in tone or in register as this is a short story book about women, and therefore it is like this is a project on gender. It's not like that. It's just these are the people who exist in the book, and then their encounters are with even more like off the cuff kind of people, very random, some of them with very strange political positions. And we were talking about this, right? How people sort of speckle this book in a very, very particular way. They seem random, they seem like you're walking on the street or entering a room full of people who you don't know, and then you find out that, oh, this person may be hatta katta and chikna and has like spiky hair, but he also reads Virginia Woolf. Like, oh, that's wonderful. uh, so yeah, a little bit about people. I know we talked about how you observe people, and your even a conversation with you is full of is full of anecdotes about somebody, a colleague in Delhi who said something, or an uncle in Kerala who like did something, or yeah.
I like the idea of characters in my book being general bodies because it sort of correlates to my being a busybody, because I am like super interested in pretty much everybody I meet, and it's very hard for me to hear anything that anyone has told me and forget it. I don't usually forget. So
Yes.
if you've told me something in 2003, I'll remember. So, and I don't say this quite as a threat. I just feel like I remember. So it's one of those things. And so then those people start taking on lives of their own in your head. Every now and then you start wondering, hey, I wonder where my friend Lakshmi's friend Nandini, who went to Yale and then was shocked by racism, where is she now? And then I could of course ask my friend Lakshmi where Nandini, who went to Yale, is. Or you start imagining things, and that's where the story goes. This thing about the women thing, honestly, I think it's only after the book was completed and my editors and everybody, we all had like many charchas about the book, that we suddenly realized that it was very, very significantly women character heavy. And later on, when the reviews came out, a couple of people were like, I don't know why the men in this book are there, because they're just not up to the par.
So
And
I've
so
received
as
this
in like
critique as well. Like,
okay,
why do you
as
have
in,
women?
they're just there. lampshade or telephone pole or whatever. And I'm like, what? I mean, I put like these two excellent villainous characters, and I love villainous characters. Two excellent villainous characters who are male in this book, and you don't like them? Like, how can you not like them? I wanted you to like feel the Mogambo feels with them, right? But in truth, it just is that I think I'm really invested in the really complicated relationships that women have with each other, which is not a sort of chal champa chal pushpa type relationship, though sometimes occasionally but it is also fractious and anxious and competitive and deeply desiring of each other and all kinds of things, right? Like you find inspiration in passing women, but you also hate them a little bit, and so many things. So that stuff is actually what I think I'm invested in, and so it's here. And I'm sure in I'm sure in your short stories and in your plays also, that ability of women characters to become sort of most important is reflects your own interest in other women and slightly less interest in gents.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like my life is powered by women in every way. Like it's fueled by women, and not in a chal pushpa, like let's launch this rocket sense, but like literally in a in a functional sense. Like it exists and is rounded, and the men. I mean, it's not to take away from anything like that. It just. I think it's also I don't know. I feel like we're dipping into a kind of collective energy, and currently for me, that involves a lot of women, and I love the fact that in Teresa, actually, the character of the wife, the newlywed, is, I love this idea of being fascinated by other women, because in truth we are, and I feel like that story touches a very particular part of us that we don't actually talk about or reveal, because like I can remember myself being on a PC and reading somebody's blog from Bombay or Delhi. I can't remember who, but I mean, who, what the name of the blog was, but I know who this person was, and be like, wow, what is this life? Like, this seems like, you're too cool for page 3 as well. And it's a part of us that we don't really, I don't know, don't talk about. It's a little embarrassing. It's all of that. But this woman just deep dives into it. It's,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
love,
no.
yeah,
So because it's a refashioning of the Daphne du Maurier novel of Rebecca. It
Rebecca, yeah.
just seemed natural that if the second wife in present day would be fascinated by the first wife, then it would be through her relics on the internet. And in this particular case, she finds her laptop, so she finds things which are online but nobody really knows about her, like her secret blog, which used to be a thing, and all kinds of things like that. And really, again, in this place, it's not about jealousy with the first husband, or Mr. De
Yeah.
Winter, as the original character was in the Daphne du Maurier book, which is now a TV series and people could watch it. So it's
Yes.
not about the husband. It's really about who am I and who is that woman and what do we have in common apart from this man, and what does it say about us, and is my fate going to be hers, and if it's not going to be, then what does it say, so that slight obsessive quality which all of us can now indulge in thanks to the internet, is what is there in that story. And it's a story, it's not one of my favorites, but a lot of people like it because I think of this essential thing, which is we do a lot of secret wondering about our lovers, previous lovers, or our spouses, previous spouses, and the people who, and we're often less jealous of potential new lovers than the lovers who are long gone and have moved to Sweden and have become sculptors or whatever.
Yeah.
So that jealousy of the past is, I think, very intriguing for many people.
Yeah, it is. And also somehow it serves as an equalizer almost, because here is this woman who has to like have these very pretentious conversations, and also feels like an outsider to this man's life. But then she, after finding all this stuff out about Teresa, and like that she had she wrote about her sexual escapades, not just with him, but with other men. Uh, she realizes that actually they have this secret communion almost, and now they're sort of I mean, they inhabit the same life, and if someone as wild and cool as her could be here and now she is, like, there's something very equalizing, very comforting about knowing that, like, somebody you look up to, or not look up to, like, fantasize about, is also flawed and insecure. And um yeah, I mean, I would certainly like for a young person to read that, because I don't know, it talks about many things that we struggle with when it comes to like romance, and that elusive X, you know. And yeah, actually, so speaking about anecdotes and people and women, um, we were talking about this thing of how you write, um, if you remember. And then you narrated this like little thing to me about how you visited your father, your and how somebody had told him that he looks very weak. Is that?
No, it's much more comical. So I went to see my parents, and my father was in a sort of steam because on his college WhatsApp group, somebody from his college WhatsApp group had called him and said, "There's a rumor making the rounds that you're very unwell, and is it true?" So, and I heard from so and so that you're unwell. So he was extremely enraged, and at that moment he wanted to come up with a response, like a kadak jawab right then. Okay, so then I said, okay, so why don't you take a photo of you doing strength training, which he does faithfully, like dumbbells. Okay, so I said, why don't we take a picture of you with your dumbbells, and then we can post a kadak jawab in the WhatsApp group to disprove all these allegations. So he immediately went and ran off and like got it and all that. So I took the photo. It was really very comical, the whole experience, and I was composing my kadak jawab on his behalf on the WhatsApp group. And then he kept looking at it and saying, no, you have to change it. So I changed it many, many times. And then I asked him, why are you like changing it so much? And he said, because 99% of men my age, who like 70-year-old men, they have no sense of humor, so you're wasting this on them. You're wasting this material on them. And it really like made my day and my week and everything. So that, I think two things happened in that story. One is, I think for me, suddenly getting a sense of what my father thinks his place in the world is, which is stuck among men with no sense of humor, and being also told that he should also be boring in some sense, he should be ill or boring or whatever. That's one thing. And the other, just trying to actually write a message that works on the WhatsApp group of 70-year-olds, like tone appropriate, this idea of writing to purpose, whatever is required at that moment, because I do all kinds of writing. I write fiction, I work with a couple of NGOs. I do lots of like different kinds of writing, and I really like that. I mean, I like the idea that you are asked to write something in that moment, and that you can try and crack it somehow. So that sort of problem solving of writing is something I really enjoy. And of course, the gossip. The gossip
The
is there.
gossip. But what is the role of that problem solving when you enter fiction?
So sometimes I worry because it doesn't feel arty enough, to say that I'm approaching this as a problem to solve. You should be like, hi, and just feel the feels. But mostly that's not the case. So I've been writing like every day in some way, in a sort of functional way, since I was 19 or 20, in different ways. So I've been a journalist. I've worked in NGOs where I was one of 100 staff, and there were like two or three of us who wrote in English. Many people spoke English, but two or three people wrote in English. And the work that was required was to communicate to different people in different ways, to interview people about crazy things that they've done during the week and capture it so that memory is not fleeting, to talk to kids, all kinds of things. And then I've worked in environmental groups where it is about writing a report about pesticides in a way that is actually interesting. Or, then there was all the journalism stuff. And the thing about making experience interesting to people who are curious but not committed to reading something dull, that is a challenge I enjoy all the time. And I like bringing that approach to pretty much everything I write. So it's not about, like, I don't like to think about writing as some sort of solving existential crisis or being therapeutic. To me, it's not about me. It has to be enjoyable and delightful for the reader. It's really not about what I'm feeling that week.
No, I hear you. And I think,
I mean, as a performer, this. I mean, this is it. This is the distillation of your thing, right? To create feeling, right, of various kinds.
yeah, and the more I think about it and the more work I make, I realize how close I am in terms of like how much closer I'm trying to get to my audience, rather than like being I don't know, one of these German artists who like has a tank of fish and like a glass of milk, and that's the performance. I mean,
and a room full of alienation, so much just so I'm like not into alienation. I was like, come be part of my nation, do not do alienation.
I agree with you. I think it's also a question of like, for me, as it is for you, I think place is very, very important. Even if it's not like, if we don't talk about a particular city, but I think a sense of place is very, very important. And I think I'm very connected to that. And therefore, whatever I build, even if it's not a geographical location, like you have to have a way to drive into it, or like you have to be able to enter it. It's kind of a world building kind of thing. And so I find even with your shortest piece in the book, you're able to do that. You're able to quickly tell us in very little, very economically, very efficiently, that this is the place, and you're invited. And I feel like this is a good time to maybe read a bit of the title story, if you don't mind, but I'm so obsessed with it.
Sure. So the title story is The Women Who Forgot to Invent Facebook. It's set in Bangalore, which is Deepika's and my hometown. And there are several other stories here which are set in other places. There's a story set in partly in Bombay and partly in Kerala. There's a story that is set entirely in Kerala. There's a story that is begins in Gurgaon and stays there. There's a story that is in I think Begumpur in Delhi. So location and how people talk and what people do in these places is something that I try to work with. But this, in that sense, was the easiest because this is about home and people I know. I met Lavanya when I was 19, and then everyone else in the world through her. When we left college, we still hung out a lot. It was 2001, and we drank a lot. We made friends with strangers. We left jobs after 3 days because we hated them. We carried small tubes of toothpaste in our rucksacks, brushed our teeth in the pub's narrow loo to scam our parents, and drove on our spindly little Lunas to our homes at opposite ends of the city. One night, Lavanya's younger brother Akhil joined us at Wiki's. We were surprised to find him rather good company. Akhil was perfect. He was an insider, so we didn't have to behave ourselves. He knew which men we were into, which ones we had slept with, which ones we had considered. Akhil was enough of a social animal that he kept track of the goings and comings in Wikis. He was enough of an outsider to our lovely twosome that we could use him as audience when we wanted to be outrageous, when we wanted to rehash old stories that only we laughed at. How Velu, the pub owner, never drank, but he was in love with Amini, the beautiful, hard drinking goddess who had been coming in night after night for years. How, when I was crushing on Jerry, I'd managed to play it really cool for weeks, only to totally lose it in the end. When I bumped into him outside the tiny loo, I looked up at him and mumbled, "I've met your mother once." Lavanya and I speculated that Akhil was gay. We even tried to set him up a couple of times, I think. One night we made friends with an Australian boy, Darren, who was swarming with studs and had a Zapatista t shirt. Akhil and Darren were all over each other. I have a hazy memory of standing outside Vicky's after Velu, the teetotaler pub owner, had personally escorted us out. Lavanya was looking for her bike keys and I was smoking. We had decided that Akhil would take Darren home because he was too drunk to go back to his PG. Akhil was giggling and leaning on Darren, who was taller by several feet. I saw Akhil trace Darren's nipples through his thin Zapatista t shirt. The next day, Lavanya called me, alternately whooping with laughter and crying. She had sobered up on the dark way home, having lost Akhil and Darren several times for short, worrying bursts. At home, she had let them in quietly without waking her parents and fallen into her bed. In the morning, her mother and father were very severe after the chaste and sober Darren had left. The previous night, while the siblings slept, Darren had woken up, stripped, and for some inexplicable reason walked out of Akhil's bedroom into the parents'. Hearing strange noises in their bathroom, the parents woke to the astonishing sight of a stark naked white boy peeing lavishly into their commode. Lavanya and Akhil and I went to Vicky's. And in the weeks that followed, Lavanya met someone, I met two someones. Akhil got laid, Darren got laid. Darren said he was bi. We introduced him to a boy we thought was gay. He wasn't, but his friend Somu was. Somu's friend George was seeing my friend Naina. Naina slept with Akhil, but only once. I stopped drinking. So,
I love it. I'll never get bored of this story. What is Vicky's? Where do you think of it?
oh, I don't know. Where could it be? So
Do you
it's like
think of
it's like a mix in my head of Pico's, the Venerable Old
Yeah.
Bar, and Koshi's,
Koshi's, right?
the Venerable Old Everything in Bangalore. But
Yeah.
it could be pretty much like anybody's old hangout in that sense,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
you
yeah.
know the waiters and you know the loo and you know the prices of everything and you just keep going back.
True. I think it's a nice like segue perhaps to talk about language, and because we're talking about place so much, did you ever worry about some of your phrases and some of the things that you talk about being too contextual, too located, that they wouldn't be, it's such a South Indian book that it won't be. It's not that it is, because you have so many stories set in Delhi, and also some stories that don't really have location but faintly mention it. Did you ever worry about that?
No, I didn't actually, because so I have had that experience of being in Delhi and having people look curiously at you. If you said anything about South India which was not Rajnikant, okay, Rajnikant is okay. Everything else is like this, and I've had that experience fairly recently also. But I think between that time and this time, I had forgotten that this was a problem. So I think my essential years growing up in Bangalore and then returning to Bangalore after a stint in Delhi, I came back to a sort of multilingual space where everybody spoke a little bit of everything, and I was the linguistic dud for I can speak English, Malayalam, like okay Hindi, very like okay type Kannada, and I have very excellent understanding of Tamil, but I cannot like really actually string sentences together, right? But most of my friends in Bangalore speak all these languages plus Telugu and can do a sort of commendable rendition of Dakhini if put to the like challenge.
Challenge.
Yeah. So I've grown up feeling like Dumbo. So then my way of dealing with this is sort of knowing a little bit of everything so that you can just sort of pretend. You just like mouth the words in the choir, having not really learned the lyrics properly like that, right? So that is my sense that everybody, if you don't quite understand, it's okay, you'll manage, right? And in actual fact, when we read books set in Latin America and Korea and Italy and wherever else, and we're watching shows and all, we're like, sab theek hai, we understand everything, it's cool, okay. So then why panic so much about some odd word? And to to be honest, because I wasn't thinking about it, I wrote however freely I felt like. And my editors also felt very free that okay, everybody will understand whatever it is to be understood. It's only when the reviews started coming and there were all these warm expressions of approval for, not translating and not italicizing and not putting footnotes for samosa or whatever. And because I mean, so far from samosa that it just struck me that it was a bit of a foolhardy thing to have done. But now now that the book has been out so many months and nobody seems to have had a problem at all, I feel very happy with the decision. The other experience that I had with this was when we were running The Lady's Finger, and we were running it mostly out of Bangalore, and we made a sort of decision to populate it with words from different languages over and over again and just let people figure out what it is. So I think about few months into running it, I had various people come to me and say, I have finally understood what the word Vanti means, because you guys use it all the time. Okay, it means like puke. But
Yes.
So that thing that if you have a sort of understanding between a compact between the reader and the writer to act in good faith, then I don't think you need a lot of footnotes and italicize. You can just be like, this is the world we live in. If you live in India, if you live 50 kilometers from your house, you are in a completely startling new universe, but you still manage to somehow get by. And that's the same way we deal with books also. So it's okay.
Yeah, I hear you. When I read the book, it didn't occur to me. It actually did occur to me when I read a couple of reviews about the book, and also I think I gave this book as a gift to a few friends, and they said, "Yeah, but we are from Bangalore, so we understand." But like, how did others respond to it? And for me, I feel like it's funny, right?
Bangalore,
Because
you imagine that only people in Bangalore can understand what is being
I was like, yeah, and it's also kind of strange because actually the worlds we're talking about, in a sense, we have certain generic experiences in like cities around the world, like this idea of a neighborhood bar, or uh, uh, like, I don't know, place is also not just like geographic, it's also the way that it's colored with the sights and smells and sounds that are somewhat universal in that sense, but also um, they're accessible because of language. Like if you were to actually like gentrify it in that sense, if you were to make it like this kind of whatever, samosa is what, folded medha patty or whatever.
Yeah. Then if you
One of those.
gentrify it, you alienate it more, right? Like you'd become slightly mystifying then.
Yeah, and actually it sort of then doesn't, I don't think the book smells of anything really, like and yeah, I mean, this is that cliche, the more specific the more universal, but I think this book is like sort of drives into that further, which is that I don't even need to let you know that this word doesn't belong to English by italicizing it. Like kunjum is kunjum and it's there, and some phrases are like brainy face, for example, is a phrase that I think I know people who have a brainy face. I don't think I'm one of them, but I said it in school. I've been like, oh, look at Lalita. She has a brainy face. She'll be good in maths. Like, uh, yeah. So I totally like. I don't know. Um, I feel that is what the book is really. That's what makes it readable. That's what makes it lush, and that's what makes it enjoyable. Um, I think that's really most of what I had to speak to you about, because I see that we're at 5:45. What, this is 7:15?
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So audience questions perhaps.
Yeah, so this is actually a great time to open it up to audiences. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat or unmute yourselves and ask us. There we have it.
There is a question.
Yes.
Oh, my favorite question, Shivaranjani. Thank you for asking me. Okay. So, I don't have a strict regimen in the sense that I write every day, but neither am I that inspired writer. Like I'm fairly like calm chalao in that sense. Like if you give me a deadline, Shivaranjani, and you say, now write this and please give it by tomorrow morning, I will more or less make it work. Okay. And so that's how this book worked also. I mean, I wrote short stories on and off, on and off. And then my editor at Context, Kartika VK, said, baby, now it's time. So then I was like, oh, shit, now it's time. Abhi, like, bang away. And so that's really how it works. And I feel very stressed by not meeting deadlines, which I have actually. This book is not the one that was supposed to come out. There was another one that was supposed to come out, which for complicated reasons haven't. It's a non-fiction book. But mostly, I guess what I'm telling you is if someone tells me this is your deadline, then I start typing madly. And so in that sense, I'm strict, but otherwise, I'm like everybody else. I'll also find ways of watching 16 hours of Netflix and say, oh, no time nowadays to do anything else.
Anyone else?
I think I really wanted to ask Nisha. So when Deepika spoke about the efficiency and the crispness of your writing, how much do you think of it comes from your training? And when I'm saying training, I'm not talking about training in the cliched sense, but while you worked at the Helka or you were working on Lady's Finger, it just makes you be economical because you've got to. So is
No.
there a sort of an
Yeah.
overlapping?
No, that really helps. As in, deadline is one thing, word count is really one thing. Like if you tell me to write to 800 words, I can write the same story more or less in 800 words, and then I can write it in 3,000 words, which might be not very great also. But I am like it is really training to use your word, just go at it from whatever parameters that have been set for you externally. The other thing is also, I think again, this is something that Deepika and I share, which is the interest that you want to retain in the person at the other end. So you want to just quickly like catch them and tell them everything before they run away for a 16-hour binge session on Netflix, because you're in strong competition with all kinds of things, right? Other people's lives, children, pandemic, TV shows with $1 million budgets, all sorts of things. So that is also part of it. Like kaan pakad ke, somehow or the other you have to make them listen to your story.
Thanks.
We have a question here.
Yeah, there's one more question. That's
Aditi Goyal. When are you writing about being Litfest junkies or anything around that space and settings? I actually
There
do
is.
a story. I have a story, Aditi, you will be very pleased to note. It's a story called The Gentle
The
Reader.
Gentle Reader.
It's about a girl who has a collection of short stories and then goes to a lit fest and is in the middle of a Twitter war and then is like generally having a meltdown and being the kind of lit fest guest that Aditi you would not be very happy with, okay? Because she's just useless.
Flaky.
Yeah, and flaky and feeling very sorry for herself. So
we come across quite a few of those, no, when we were Litfest attendees. Somebody else is asking a question.
Do you believe in ghosts?
I mean, in a fictional way, huh? Like, I mean, without ghosts, what would fiction be? It would be so, it would be like, let us write fiction without the letter E. Ghosts are completely necessary. But in actual practice, like if I have to go from my bedroom to the kitchen at night, I put on all the lights, okay? I don't want to check. I don't want to do like any fact checking on this front. If it's there, please, like, don't come. Not to my house.
Right. I think some people will take time to raise, this whole Zoom pay, raise your hand rubbish also happens. So I think we haven't spoken enough about Lady's Finger. What led to, because it's an intriguing name, and I'm sure our audiences would love to know more about that. Also, because the kind of writing you put up through Lady's Finger was absolutely admirable.
So it was really a fun part of my life. For 5 years, my friends and I, my husband, my friends and I, we ran a website called The Lady's Finger, and it started, out of our apartment, and then we had staff and we had syndication contracts, and we had a horoscope writer, and all kinds of things, right? So the idea was that we would have a feminist website for women who want to be reading about all kinds of things. So our joke at that time was, it was a very bad joke, but basically the joke was that to be in the media as a woman, either you have to be the victim of some violence, or you have to be the ICICI Bank chairperson. Like everybody in between, which, to borrow Deepika's phrase, general bodies did not appear anywhere. But I mean, general bodies are so interesting and doing all kinds of interesting things and had so many things to say, that it was kind of to our shock that such a space did not exist then. So in 2013 summer, we started it and we ran it for 5 years, and it had really all kinds of things. People talking about all kinds of things, and it was a really fun and entertaining thing to do. Like if you ask me what is the 5 most fun years of my life, that was the 5 most fun years of my life.
Yeah, what a thing you made. Really.
And coincidentally, one of Deepika's productions debuted in our
Oh yes.
tiny
Yes,
office.
yes.
And, like
Yes.
everybody was like smashed in the evening, and we drank thumbs up, and it was the beginning of great things.
Yeah, it was the beginning of a long journey.
No rest.
No rest.
Right. Also, what next, Nisha? What are you working on in terms of another book?
So I'm working on two things that I will not name, but I will say vaguely, only because I'm feeling superstitious. I'm working on a book of nonfiction, much delayed book of nonfiction, which hopefully should be done by the end of this year. And I'm also working on some translation. And to be honest, I'm more excited about the translation, which is very jolly, as opposed to my writing, which is very like Marela right now. So
No, I don't think your writing is anywhere. It's always sparkling.
no. Eventually, after doing much like aerial surf and all, it'll be. Right now, it's in the Marela phase. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Well, the translation part really excites me because obviously I am completely committed and interested in that as Syahi.
So
And
soon, I
quick,
think in a month or two, that should be done.
Oh, okay.
I'm being like superstitious because it's my first time and that I'm giving a shot at it. So we'll see how it goes.
no, that's fine. It's good to be sometimes superstition kind of helps us, it keeps us going, you know. And even I subscribe to that. I would normally tell people that I'm not going to talk about this till I know that it's been done, like that bridge has been crossed, kind of thing. But I think you've left our audiences rather overawed.
No, it's not that. It's not overall. I'm so sorry. I have to tell your audience also. This happens fairly often with my events, that it makes me very worried that there are very few audience questions. It's perhaps what happens if you sit in the drawing room with someone who talks a lot, and then you feel like, okay, I just need to lie down a little bit and recover from this onslaught. Okay, so I think that's what happened. I sincerely hope that it is nothing more. But I know that if I'm in a conversation with Deepika, it cannot be boring. So, guys, it's not that we bored you.
No, no, not at all. In fact, I think what they're really taking in is again the crispness and the efficiency of the way you speak as well. I'm going to quote Deepika again because I really like the way she captured the writing part. Um, and you're actually giving them a lot to think about. Yeah, but from the gender point of view, from the feminist point of view, um, where do you think did
I'm
you when you
lost
mentioned your
there for
work?
a second, Mita. Where do I think what?
I was saying that the pandemic has left us all damaged in some way or the other. And you mentioned your work with a couple of NGOs. Did you get my question?
Something about my work with NGOs.
Yes. Oh, am I okay? So what I'm saying is pandemic, effect of pandemic, especially on women. Is it connected with your work with the kind of NGOs you
Not,
work with?
not really connected to my work, but like everyone else, I mean, I have a strong understanding that the fact that I'm able to work is dependent on the care work of like Hajar women. The book is unwritten, the next book is unwritten, but my dedication is written already. It is going to be written to about 12 women who have helped take care of my house and my kids in the last 3 years. So both my kids were born preemie, so they spent like a month in hospital, and they were just like this big, and it's really because of other women that they like lived, first nurses and then nannies at home and everything. So it's the pandemic. Just if ever I had any delusion that I was doing all this by myself, okay, all of that was like wiped clean with the pandemic. It is impossible for women to do any work without like a full village district of other people doing work with them. So that definitely, I think one connected thing which I wanted to mention, and something that has come up in a couple of pieces about like written pieces about my book is, and I found it interesting, is the idea that there are women and men in this book who say politically very like unpalatable things, right? They say like rude things. Like one character says, oh, he's like, she's on a date and she says, oh, he's that one good type Muslim fellow. I'm not sure, I was so into him, like he wanted me to read like progressive things, and basically she's not progressive, she's not interested in his politics, whatever. Okay. Or someone who believes that reservation is like a really stupid thing, or a whole lot of people who believe that fat people are dumb and fat is an indication of moral failure. So I was asked a couple of times, and there was this stuff in the reviews also, which is this thing about how is it okay to have these um, like sort of unpalatable views in your character, and I found that interesting. I thought that was the work of fiction, to sort of create a universe in which people say and feel and do all kinds of things, and it doesn't closely match your beliefs, whatever my beliefs may be. So that, just like the language thing, but more surprisingly than the language thing, that comment I found, like I wasn't prepared for that to come, because I didn't think that was a problem for fiction at all. But sort of a youngish interviewer asked me, weren't you afraid that people would think that these are your views? And I was pretty gobsmacked by that. But I mean, you live and learn. So this is
Yeah. No, I
you.
quite agree with what you're saying. It's strange that people should react that way, but I think we are coming to the end of the
Nita, there's
session.
one more question, I think, from Durva.
Yeah, but then Deepika will leave and go away. So can I take the question, Deepika, with your permission? And even if you leave, can I thank you already for having held the
Yes,
session together so beautifully? I think it was a perfect session with you and Nisha going back and forth. So thank you. Stay till you can, and we'll take the question.
thank you.
So Durva says, do you approach non-fiction writing in a different manner compared to short stories?
Yeah, I do. And, but there's all kinds of nonfiction. For instance, I write a column twice a month for Mint. And now I write a column for a fashion website called Voice of Fashion. And which is like, if you knew me, you would find this like extremely comical. But the thing is, it is for me a problem solving approach. Like, what is it that I'm trying to say? And how can I make it as clear as possible, as entertaining as possible? So for instance, in my last column for the fashion website for Voice of Fashion, I wrote about women wearing clothes, like good clothes and good makeup and hair, while taking phone calls. So you take your call, but you take it outside your house. So you're walking up and down, but you're wearing like perfectly dressed, and everything is like proper, but it's not quite your office clothes. It's somewhere in between. So it took me a while to figure what that was. And I realized it is your going for a boho weekend outfit. Okay. And I think the essential thing that has happened is that everybody hates tight clothes now. That is my conclusion. People's clothes have become like looser. So once where we condemned people as wearing nighties, we are all in a permanent nightie state. So this sort of thing of trying to capture something in like say 600 words for a monthly thing. So those are very specific parameters that nonfiction writing sets if you're doing it as journalism, and I find that very interesting and challenging to do. More open-ended nonfiction, like I've written say a 3,000 word story about um a particular seminar. Say, okay, so this was the year after Nirbhaya, the Delhi gang rape, and it was about a bunch of girls who participated, the teachers, the girls in the panel, the audience, the sort of various experts who had come for the panel. Okay, so it's like a very like non-significant panel. But for a year later, when you interview them, everybody's memories of that panel and the fights that happened in that panel and what the men and the women said to each other was completely different. And one expert had brought some sort of toy as a demonstration, and people couldn't even agree about what the toy was. One person said it was a teddy bear, one person said it was a lion. Okay, then so for me, that thing of interviewing people and then trying to understand how their feelings about the gang rape had changed over that 1 year, and about their own safety had changed over 1 year. So that sort of larger project also can be very interesting, but it's also something that you allow yourself the freedom to do that because you learn so much from fiction, and from fiction you can think of frames to do for nonfiction. So those are when you set your own parameters. I don't know whether that answers your question, Durva, but I was just saying that there are many approaches even for nonfiction.
That's true. That's true. But thank you so much, Nisha. I think it was just one, so good to see you again. And two, very compelling as always. And the honesty is so refreshing. And your humor obviously sparkles always.
Okay, thank you so
Uh,
much. Thanks so
but
much. We have lost Deepika, who's my fun friend and has always been my fun friend. I'm so happy to have had her in this event. Thank you so much for inviting me.
not at all. And I think our audiences, I can see the comments coming in, and my phone is on silent, but it's buzzing with nice session, great talk. All of that is happening. But it was really good to see you. Now, I just have one announcement for all my audiences. For everyone who attended, please send your postal addresses to 8529747745. I'm repeating the number 8529747745 in the next 48 hours, because we'd like to courier a copy of Nisha's book to each one of you. And yes, we do that. Thank you so much, everyone who took out time this evening and um, to be with us. And we look forward to the next Right Circle session. Thanks. Thanks, Nisha.
Bye bye.